Welcome to this week's LinkedIn Live event. Today's topic is unlocking a sales framework for non-sales professionals. First, why is a selling episode here in my Dynamic Leadership series? It's a mini series, it's the first of three, and it's here because as we progress into dynamic leadership, it's important to address a critical skill that every owner, leader, and executive needs, but rarely talks about. That topic is selling. Now, whether you're pitching a vision to your team, negotiating with stakeholders, or building relationships with clients, selling is unavoidable. The ability for an owner, executive, or leader to influence and guide decisions is essential to driving your business forward. And that includes nonprofit organizations as well. That's why this three-part series on selling is included in the larger framework of dynamic leadership. Plus, if you can get some growth going and some revenue, it will help you speed up the process of establishing your leadership team. It's not just about making sales, it's about aligning your leadership with your ability to inspire action and create lasting impact. And as I said, give you resources to move that forward. By mastering a selling approach that reflects your values and strengthens your credibility, you'll not only grow your business, but also elevate your leadership. In this three-part mini-series, we'll explore how you can lead and sell with confidence, integrity, and influence. Knowing you have a sales framework that won't let you down is an important part of that. As a business owner or leader, you're likely wearing many hats. While sales may not be your primary role, it's an essential skill that you can't afford to ignore. Whether you're negotiating with investors, rallying your leadership team, or presenting your product or service to a high-value client, your ability to influence and guide decisions is central to driving success. This is why selling is integral to leadership. It's not just about making sales. It's about aligning your leadership with your ability to inspire action and create lasting impact. But here's the challenge. Most sales strategies are designed for professional salespeople working with typical buyers, and often under quota pressures. These approaches feel out of sync for owners and leaders, especially when selling isn't about hitting numbers, but creating alignment, building trust, and advancing your business goals. That's why I've developed a framework specifically for non-sales professionals, a framework designed for non-sales pros who find themselves in high-stakes selling situations, but need a repeatable process that feels natural, builds credibility, and aligns with how people prefer to make decisions, especially buying decisions. Now, why this framework matters. The world of sales is often built on tactics to manipulate emotions, fear, greed, or scarcity to close deals. But for owners and executives, it's not about making the sale at all costs. You need a sustainable approach that enables you to attract ideal clients, foster long-term relationships, and that reflects the reputation and values of your organization. This framework shifts the focus from selling to guiding decisions. It draws on timeless principles of human behavior. Relevant tenets include things like people make decisions to meet needs they often don't fully understand. Human nature is deeply rooted in patterns, biases, and cognitive shortcuts shaped over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Effective influence works with these natural patterns, not against them. Now, understand the patterns, and you can apply the framework instead of chasing the latest sales trends. I'll cover some of the other popular sales methodologies to show how this is all aligned, and they all are following a basic principle of identifying and then meeting those needs. This framework is different because, again, it's designed for the professional who's often talking to people who they're not sales, they're not typical buyers, and you may not have formal sales calls. So this process leverages proven psychological insights to help you navigate any selling situation with confidence and control. Now, what you'll learn in this three-part series. Today, I'll lay the foundation for the framework, starting with the fundamentals of human behavior that drive decision-making. I'll explore why people often buy things that they don't need or use, and how you can avoid both sides of this trap. I'm sure we've all been there. The difference between emotional, logical, and fear-based buyers, and why this framework works for all of them. How understanding human needs and cognitive biases can keep you in control of the sales process. I'll also provide a high-level roadmap for the overall framework. Over the next 2 episodes, after this one, we'll break it down into actionable steps. Part 1 will cover the specific stages of the first part of the process, from engaging an interested prospect to addressing the transition to the closing sequence. Part 2 will focus on the closing sequence, which includes seamlessly working through objections, asking for referrals, and building long-term value, even if the sale doesn't happen on that first go-round. Now, who is this for? This series is for owners, executives, and professionals. Anyone who doesn't sell to typical buyers and who doesn't work under quotas or sales pressures. It's designed for those selling ideas to investors, projects to stakeholders, products and services to high-value clients. If you've ever struggled to apply traditional sales advice in your unique situations, this framework may be what you're looking for. The framework is rooted in human nature, so it's unlikely to become outdated anytime soon. Again, the brain is over 100,000 years old, and this is based on the fundamentals of that kind of neuroscience. Now, at its core, the framework reflects a deep understanding of how people think, decide, and act. As I said, it's built on principles that align with human nature. Now, here are some examples. People often follow what has worked for them in the past. Understanding their history gives you clues about their future choices. Human needs drive decisions. Even when buyers say no, they often still need what you're offering. They just need help overcoming the inner battle that accompanies most big decisions. Remember, the subconscious doesn't like the unfamiliar, and what you're offering probably falls into the category of unfamiliar, especially the first time they're hearing about it. The best sales processes don't feel salesy. Most sophisticated buyers don't like being sold, so that's why these come together in this framework. The framework is designed to guide prospects through a natural decision-making journey, building trust and credibility along the way. Not just with you, but with their own internal conversation of checks and balances that's constantly running in the background. No pushy tactics here or manipulating emotions. It's about understanding how to sell in a way that is effective and feels natural for the people that you're engaging with. Before I go any further, everyone watching this video may already be ready to sell, but there's a chance that you've faced roadblocks that have held you back. Selling, like money, often involves complex relationships and mental hurdles internally. These blockages can cause even the best efforts to falter through what feels like self-sabotage, causing hesitation and more. Getting past those hurdles isn't in the scope of this framework, but I'd like to point you toward a resource that might help. I invite you to watch my video on high-performance self-coaching. It's a webinar, and the link is actually in the description to this video. While it's not specifically about selling, it's designed to help you overcome the parts of yourself that may be getting in the way of your purpose, growth, contribution, and goals and priorities. The same way that people with agency are impervious to manipulative hacks and tricks, personal agency can also empower you to be intentional and follow through on your goals and priorities. The link to that video is in the description, and regardless of where you are on your journey, I think you'll find it valuable as you develop personal leadership and agency in your life and business. Now, what to expect? Today's session, as I said, is foundational. You won't walk away with quick tips to close deals tomorrow, but you will gain the insights needed to master the framework that we get into in the next 2 weeks. By starting with the fundamentals, you'll be equipped to apply this process effectively in any selling situation, whether it's in a networking conversation, a business meeting, or a high-stakes sales presentation. Let's get into the principles, psychology, and roadmap that make up this framework. It's a game changer for owners and leaders. Now, whether you're selling a product, an idea, or a vision, this mini-series will help you do it with confidence, integrity, and success. I'd love to hear your feedback. Let's jump in. So the first thing I want to do is just, again, talk about some of the fundamentals. I'm going to start with this wheel. So we're going to be going along a roadmap. This is what we're going to use as we roll along that road. And I'm setting it up in such a way that once we're on the roadmap, you'll always know where you are and you'll always know the next steps to take. And because it's based on how humans work, like I said, it's not going to be outdated. And it puts you in a position so that you can manage the framework dynamically and in real time. And I want to make a comment here. The reason I say this is for non-sales professionals. It will work for salespeople, 100%. This is aligned with every sales training methodology I've seen. The difference is that salespeople are put in a place to get sales. While it may not be talked about, it's expected that they're going to push for the sale, even when it's not a perfect fit for the client. And you've been in that situation where you probably bought something that didn't really fit. It didn't meet what you needed, and it's because you got caught up in the emotion of the sale. And next thing you know, you're driving home in a car that was your third or fourth choice, but you bought it. Salespeople don't have the luxury to walk away when the needs are not met. But here's the thing: the way we're going to lay this out, there's a finite number of human needs. They are generalized across all the people that you're going to meet and run and talk to. And if your service doesn't meet their needs today, and we're starting with those fundamental human needs, there might be a time in the future that it does. So you want to protect that relationship. Not only that, when you treat each client right, they become a source of referral. So one of the things we want to think about is we want to constantly be filling our pipeline with referrals, whether it's from people who've bought or people that you've interacted with. And some of those referrals can become centers of influence where they really buy into what you're doing, your product or service, and that results in them sending more and more people your way. If you are in sales, don't feel like I'm not going to be speaking to you. Just recognize that you may not have the luxury to do some of the things that we talk about on the roadmap. A big part of it was the takeaway, that when it didn't meet, you closed the door. You decided, and that's a part of it. You decide when the sales process is over. We got the wheel, and we're going to start with conditioning. And that probably doesn't surprise you. If you've watched my content, you know that I base things around how the brain works, and that's a big part of that is conditioning. And the reason I do that is because it's principles, right? It's foundational. We know that how conditioning works. We know it's not going to change. We know the brain is hundreds of thousands of years old. So why recreate I'd rather see us work with what we know works, with best practices, proven best practices and principles. So in the conditioning, we have beliefs, we have our habits of thought. And a lot of times you can see these habits of thought play out in the presentation while you're talking to the client. You can also identify them when you start talking about how they made decisions in the past. We have priming. When I first learned to sell, it was with a company called Success Motivation Institute, specifically the subsidiary Leadership Management Incorporated. And they had what I would call a canned sales presentation. It was a sales methodology, a sales process. And what I noticed with this canned sales presentation is that it worked when you could go through the whole presentation with the person from start to finish. It built emotion. It built it to a crescendo, and it closed at the right time. This thing was built, think about the name of the company, Success Motivation Institute. It was built on years and years and years of trial and error, practice, tweaking here and tweaking there. And that presentation showed me how important it is to have a sales presentation. And this is why in many sales books, you'll hear them talk about you have to practice. The best salespeople practice. Even if you don't have a canned sales presentation, you still need to practice because it helps you with your timing, it helps you with your delivery. But having this canned sales presentation, anyone could pick it up, and if they took the time to learn it, they would sell. Or one of my clients used to sell fire alarms, and I went out with him on one of his sales calls to a home, and it was the same thing. This thing was super canned. He would sell, this is in the early 80s, and he would sell like $3,000. Think about that number in the early 80s, $3,000 worth of fire alarms, fire protection in a person's home that he just met. Now, he did rely on referrals, but again, it was a canned sales presentation, and I watched him over a couple of times, and you could see how just like a successful public speaker, they do the same routine. It's the same mini skits throughout the whole presentation. It was the same thing with him, and he would get animated. It was always at the same point, and he just brought people in. If you've ever bought a timeshare, you've bought some of these things I'm talking about. You've sat through one of these kinds of presentations. You know what I'm talking about. You fall into like a trance. And the way they work is it's constantly priming, and you're priming the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and you're literally bringing the people along. Today, enough people have experienced buying things that they didn't need, and so you build up some resistance. And that doesn't change how we're wired. It doesn't change the habits, but it does make us say no to things that we may have otherwise said yes to. But remember, we got 100 billion neurons, so you can turn off a whole lot of those neural pathways, and there's still plenty more to keep working. So we have priming, we have beliefs, we have cognitive biases here, and there's other heuristics as well, but I'll just roll those up into cognitive biases. And these are tied into priming. When you understand them, you can actually apply them, and that's why I like using a framework for non-sales professionals versus a methodology or defined sales process, because you have to be able to change it as you go. You have to make adjustments on the fly. Again, just like dynamic leadership, one size does not fit all, but when you understand the principles, you can make the changes yourself along the way. We're going to put positioning here, the power of positioning, and that gets into associations, right? When you have positioning, it automatically tells somebody where something fits. That's one of the tenets of marketing is positioning. And what's the position statement? Once you can position something in somebody's mind, the heuristics kick in, cognitive biases, it's like priming, and they begin to feel like they know what you're talking about. So you have to be careful, because it can go both ways. You don't want to position your product or service as something else. You don't want to bring up things that might take a person down a path that's not supportive of what you're attempting to do. And then I'll talk about the 7 factors of unconscious influence. Now, I met Robert Cialdini in 1990 or so, right around the time, or just shortly after he wrote the book Influence. And he spoke on stage for a while, and one of the things he said is in that time, he was really adamant about not using this for bad, right? He made it a point that this was about helping people protect themselves from being tricked or persuaded against their will or desires. But as you know, people are going to do what people do. And he still talks about that. In his book, Persuasion, he talks about it as well. But the book Persuasion was written more for the people on the marketing side, whereas Influence, interestingly enough, was written for people for protection, sort of like defense as opposed to offense. And I'll say the same thing. None of what I'm talking about is for ill will. This is about helping people, ideal prospects, see that they are the ideal prospect for the service you provide, and then help them get over their own inhibitions to make that purchase. It's very different from the salesperson who's told that they've got to make the sale, and they'll convince somebody to get their third, fourth, or fifth choice just because that's what's available, knowing that the person could have had their number one choice if they had done something else. And that's just the way it is. I'm not knocking that, but that's again why I talk about this as being for non-sales professionals. So the 7 factors of unconscious influence, and they're not in any specific order. I like to start with the because frame. And he took this out. So it went from 7 factors. Back in the early 90s, he was talking about 7 factors of unconscious influence, and he changed it to now it's 6. If you look at it, recent editions of the book, I see that it's 6. And because frame was taken out. And the because frame is going to be important, because when we get into the presentation, you'll see that it's about controlling the pace along the roadmap. You're not controlling what the prospect thinks. You're not controlling what they want. You're controlling the pace. And sometimes we have to slow things down. And the reason I'm bringing it up here with the because frame is every question warrants a response, but it doesn't necessarily warrant an answer to what they're asking. And the because frame enables you to bypass some of those questions by saying, oh, yeah, that makes sense, but we're going to hold that off because. And the short version of the because frame is they found that regardless of what followed the word because, this is Robert Cialdini's research, regardless of what followed the word because, the compliance levels were almost the same as if what followed it was very, very logical. They use an example in the original book about somebody who was double parked, and they said, can I get in front of you because I'm double parked and I'm in a hurry? And X amount of people let them in front. Then they did it the same thing but without the word because, and it dropped something like half of the compliance. And we're talking about a fairly high number in the 60% to start. And then they did, may I get in front of you because I need to make some copies? And the compliance shot way back up to almost where they were talking about double park. So it's almost like people shut off their logic meter once they hear the word because. So it's a useful tool when we get into the framework, and we have to regain control when a prospect is taking us off track with these different questions. The next thing we have is reciprocity. And reciprocity is important because it's not just actual things that you're giving. It's perception too. When you can help people perceive that what you're offering them is something of value, giving them information is something of value, that can start the reciprocity action in place as well. And again, I don't want to, like I said, spill a candy in the lobby. We'll get into more of this, but reciprocity is a big part of it because you're always giving information in a sales presentation, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you want to position it in such a way that it is shown as it's received as value. Then we have rapport. And we're going to take this to another level because there's been a lot written about rapport. You've heard of mirroring and matching, and that works, and there's reason why it works. But when this book was written, mirror neurons were very, very much in the infancy. They had just learned about mirror neurons, I think it was in the 80s, 1980s, and first documented in early 90s. But the mirror neurons are probably why mirroring and matching works. But in addition to rapport, we're going to have know, like, and trust. So you've got to have more than just rapport. You have to have a know, like, and trust component because that's what's going to enable somebody to buy from you. And we've all heard of situations where a person left a company or a salesperson or a product or service, even though it was a good fit, even though it was the best price, and they left it because of the relationship. We also know that there are people who've bought things that were way more, that didn't really meet their needs, and they did so because of the relationship. So you don't want to ignore the know, like, and trust component, and I'll call that the subset of rapport. Then we have authority. And you may remember this study was done way back in the 50s. There was some research, and they had the guys in the white lab coats, and the white lab coat represented authority, and the subjects, it was double-blind stuff, and so the person who was the subject didn't realize that they were actually a subject. They thought that they didn't understand how they were being viewed as the subject, and their job was to give a shock to this person who's behind glass every time they got a wrong answer, and the person in the white coat would get them to give shocks that were stated to be lethal, and it even had warnings on the panel to say that, do not exceed, it could be lethal, but the person still gave them the shock. Now, it was an actor behind the glass, and so they really believed that they were potentially killing this person, but they did it, and it was shown they did it because of the white lab coat and the authority. You can't watch, and you can find it on YouTube, I'm sure. It's hard to watch that video and not have it change how you view information that's coming. And I think everybody should watch it and recognize that it's playing into these cognitive biases. When I looked at cognitive biases that impact people in terms of reaching their goals, there were easily 36 of them. It's probably well over 100 cognitive biases, but I identified 36 that actually hurt people in terms of reaching their goals. And when I first started down that path, I thought I was going to be teaching more about cognitive biases, and what it turned into, because it was so many and so complex and so intertwined, it actually led to inserting a step. And that's actually in the high performance self-coaching video that I talked about in the introduction. Another one is scarcity. And authority and scarcity, you can get to your fear-based buyers that way. It's illegal to introduce false scarcity, at least in some states. The reality is, chances are, if something is running out, there's going to be a better option available. There's always going to be another course. There's always going to be another solution for whatever it is that a person is looking to buy. So I don't want to overstate what scarcity does, but that said, that doesn't mean you can't introduce some things like early bird specials to help you along. If you can introduce it in a way that's ethical, but not something where you're lying to people. And then we have social proof and then consistency. You don't have to remember all of these, but it's worth it to read the book Influence, and I would also recommend reading the book Persuasion. You want to understand them. The more you understand them, the better you're going to be able to apply them. I'd like to remind people that life is not an on-off switch. It's much more like a dimmer switch. We come out of school where 70% was passing and people were trying to get 100%, and maybe they get bummed out when they got an 80, but they were still in the game, right? Even if you had a 65, you were still in the game. And when we get into the workplace, the communication is such that it gets people into this thinking that it's pass fail, and life is not pass fail. And this can hurt us when it comes to learning new things, right? Because we're trying to develop a skill, and we have a standard of pass fail. Imagine the kids in the skate park learning tricks. If they had a pass fail, if they didn't get the trick on the first try, they give up and go home. It wouldn't make any sense to you. You would know that there's something wrong with that. But we bring that thinking into work, and I offer the same thing with this. You won't be perfect the first time out. It's going to take some work. It's going to take some trial and error. You're going to have to find your time. I do recommend practicing in front of a mirror, and working with different, think about deep practice, right? Just use different tonality, try different things, find your voice with it, and practice, and then start integrating the 7 factors of unconscious influence. And again, by reading the book and starting to understand them and say, okay, I'm going to focus on using reciprocity. And then another 2 weeks pass and I'm going to focus on using authority, or I'm going to focus on using social proof, and start building the skills around that. The next one we're going to talk about is needs. Now, the needs are going to be simpler than this, and I'm going to start with something that's familiar, and that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You'll know that he talks about the physiological needs as the base. We have to have food and water. We have to have some nourishment. We have to get some rest. And then he talks about the safety needs. You got to have some shelter. You have to have some protection. And the way I look at this, imagine if you were dropped off on a deserted island. And on that deserted island, you were left to fend for yourself. The first thing you do, you have to find food, or you're not going to be around much longer. So you got to find a way to eat. And then once you're eating, the next thing you have to do is create some safety. You have to create some security. You have to have some weapons, perhaps, or maybe you need some shelter. You need some way to protect your food, but also some way to protect yourself from predators. So that's the safety thing. And this ties into a definition of success that I use, which is success is the progressive realization of predetermined worthwhile personal goals. And that's how I came to look at it that way, because I said no matter what happens, if you lose everything, which I did, by the way, when I had to close my motorcycle business in the face of COVID, it doesn't matter where you are or what happened. You always have the opportunity to start with progressive realization of predetermined worthwhile personal goals. And it's a very personal thing. It's about you. Nobody's telling you what these goals are. So that's the safety needs. And this is what you're doing on the island. This is what would happen. The next thing you have is love and belonging. Now, of course, on the island, that gets a little bit harder to do if you're deserted and the only one there. And then you have esteem. So the thing about esteem needs, this is very subjective. You decide what you need. You decide when you've arrived, not somebody else. And so esteem is actually in your control. And the next one is in your control as well. So self-actualization is at the top of his hierarchy of needs. And self-actualization is something that we get to do after we've met all the other needs, according to Maslow. But the reality is, we can decide when we've had enough on the physiological. We can decide when we have enough safety. We can decide when we have enough belonging. We can decide when we have enough recognition or esteem. So we get to decide when we start self-actualization. Now you'll see people chasing and chasing and chasing. They're filling a hole that can't be filled. People always are going after some next brass ring, but they're filling an emptiness inside in many cases. And that emptiness inside can't be filled with external things. They've got to do it on the inside. This is why on my 7 Fitness framework, I talk about making the shift from have, do, be to be, do, have. And once you're being that kind of person, you don't have this need for external validation because it's coming from within. You're being. A lot of people don't realize is Maslow's also responsible for the 6 human needs. He rolled that up into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, they don't directly map across. We have the 6 human needs, which are variety, certainty, connection, significance. And if you look at these, variety and certainty can be on opposite ends of a continuum, as can connection and significance. They can be on opposite ends of the continuum. And this gets back into the empty hole. If people are trying to get significance, if you need significance, there's never enough. The goalpost keeps changing. People who need validation, there's never enough validation. Why? I mean, if they get validated and then they feel good, well, then they realize that it took validation to make me feel good, and that very thought invalidates them. And now they need validation to know that they don't really need to be validated to feel good, and it goes on and on and on. The way the 6 human needs works is that by focusing on growth, the last 2 needs, growth and contribution, you can get the variety, the certainty, the connection, the significance that you want by focusing on growth and contribution. And so we're going to look at these needs as we walk through the framework. And then we have the self-determination theory, and that's autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Now, if you watched my earlier episodes on dynamic leadership, I went through the same thing. Why? Because it's back to human needs. It's consistent with what I'm talking about when I say the brain is over 100,000 years old, so why recreate the wheel? Let's start with the best practices. So if you always go back to human needs, you're not going to be wrong. You may not be right every single time because people get moved and swayed, but if you stand on the truth, the world's going to conform around you. And to me, when you look at people's needs, you're getting very close to what that core is. The last one, I won't talk about it today much, but this gets into your service and product. I don't want to tell you how to sell your product. This is what methodologies do, and when there's sales training, one of the things that sales training will do, it'll work through the methodology for that particular business so that the salespeople have the words and the talk tracks on what to say. But I will tell you that it's consistent. There's features and benefits, and then there's features, advantages, and benefits. There's features and benefits and meaning, or advantages and meaning. So in other words, this has an advantage over that. What that means to you is. So you're putting it in those kinds of words. The features and benefits, people don't buy the feature, they buy the benefit. And I'll use examples as we go next week because everybody's selling something different. Some people are selling services, some people are selling tangibles. But I'm going to use automobiles. And the reason I'll use automobiles is because automobiles have so many features that people are not interested in when they buy the car. Mostly everyone has bought a car, at least understand the concept of it, and we'll be able to talk through making the shift from a feature or an advantage or a benefit or meaning. The other thing we'll do is bring up things like from spin selling, which is situation, problem, implication, and then need. And that's a very popular one. I like spin selling concepts because, one, he makes a big point in the book about how sales training doesn't really work. When they look at sales training before and after, or they look at how people's sales presentations changed before and after the sales presentation, the sales training, the benefit doesn't come from the training, it comes from the focus. And he spends quite a bit in the book talking about that. The making the distinction between explicit needs and implicit needs and being able to listen for that. There's also consultative selling. You're solving the person's problems, and your solution, your offer or product or service is the solution. This is why I was saying this kind of conversation puts salespeople in an awkward spot, because if you take it through the natural path, the salesperson would be telling the person that they're not a good prospect. If a typical sales manager heard their salesperson tell a prospect that they're probably not a good prospect for this particular service or product, not all of them, but some of them would have a challenge with that. Imagine being seeing a car salesman tell the sales manager that, that I didn't tell him that car because he wanted a blue one and we only have red. That's not going to fly. They're supposed to sell the red one. They've got to rework it to sell the red one. And that's different from what a business owner is going to be doing or what a doctor is going to be doing with a patient. We don't want to be selling people on stuff that they don't need. And then there's NEAT selling, N-E-A-T, the need, economic impact, access to authority, timeline. So a lot of these acronyms and mnemonics are there to help salespeople work through it. Understand that when we get into the solution part, it's consistent with that. You will leave the second session with enough information to start working on your own sales process / methodology. Obviously, we won't get into that. That's much more of a workshop exercise where you have to literally work through the kinds of open-ended questions, the kind of either-or questions that you're going to use. What does the close look like? What kind of objections are you likely to get? That's going to be out of scope here, but you'll see the placeholders that we use in the framework. I'll give you the sales framework so you have an idea as to whether or not you even want to tune in. The first thing you have is you have to have rapport. I'm going to use confirm so that I don't trip over the word qualify. But remember, I said we're starting with an interested person and an interested prospect, and we have to confirm that there's some interest. And then we start building on the know, like, and trust. So this might be a place where you exit out of the conversation. And then we're going to take that into fact finding. There's no rocket science here because all sales processes follow a similar track. You have fact finding. I added, instead of just going into the presentation, I added transition because there's things that have to happen in this transition, and I need to call that out. And then we have demonstration. The reason I call it demonstration instead of presentation is, one, I want it more active, and two, I want it more prescriptive based on what we found in the fact finding. So in the demonstration, you're not just presenting, you're actually demonstrating how this meets their needs. You're using illustrations, examples, you're putting them into it, you're involving them. And then we have the recommendation and we have the close. Now this recommendation will sound like a close in traditional selling. This recommendation is actually the close, but the reason I don't call it a close is because closing ratios tend to be 20, 30, maybe 40%. So most of the people who receive a close don't buy. So rather than make that the close, that is the first opportunity for them to buy. And I call it a recommendation. That's the first opportunity for them to buy. Close becomes the second, third, and fourth opportunity to buy. So the stall and objection procedure is actually built into the close. And then we have referrals. And the referrals would happen if they buy at the first stop, the second, so referrals always happen. And this is just a rough of the framework, and we'll go through, we should be able to get through the first half of the transition next week, and then we'll do the second part the following week. And I'll throw in some additional help that we can use for the mental game, because there is a big mental game, both for you and the person who's buying. We'll also talk about how to maintain control through this process, and we'll get into it next week, Friday morning, to do episode 5, which is part 2 of the 3-part sales framework for non-sales professionals miniseries. All right, see you then.